splash. That was me kicking over that cup. You know, as I read this gospel story, I think that there is something to be said for setting the bar low. Because I certainly think that most preachers would agree that their first sermon went much better than Jesus's did, at least as far as Luke's gospel is concerned. I mean, I'm not going to say that mine was necessarily a better sermon, but I can say that no one tried throwing me off of a cliff after I finished it. There's a reason why I stick to places that have a low topography. See, there is, however, an uncomfortable reality in this text. Jesus is being confrontational. And that might be something that we struggle with a bit today. Now, I wanted to expand the gospel reading today because initially we would have only had the second half of this story, and I feel like you needed the full context. The first half was last week's gospel message, but because we had the Feast of St. Paul, we heard a different text. So I wanted to fill in the gaps for us today. And now, I think when we talk about Jesus being confrontational, there are times that we really don't mind it. When Jesus is talking with the Pharisees or the scribes, when he's talking with the chief priests, you know, then we're all about Jesus giving them the what for. But in this story here, these are just regular run-of-the-mill folk. These are people who just came to the local synagogue to worship. Really not all that different from you and I. And this text starts off so well. What is Jesus doing that these people are blown away by his words? They are excited. They even say, what are these words of grace that he speaks? They can't believe the wisdom that is coming from this son of Joseph. And while there is speculation in some of the other Gospels that this might have been a mockery, a hit at Jesus, pointing out, isn't this Joseph's son? Isn't this the carpenter's son? What is he doing up there? Here in Luke, there's no indication of that. Who is this Jesus, they think, who speaks with such authority, who speaks with such grace? And Jesus isn't done yet. He dares to insinuate and then to blatantly say out loud that his message is meant for others and not for them, the very people who were in the synagogue to hear him speak. And I think it's easy to point fingers at those who are gathered in Nazareth, to think that we would never do such a thing as to try and throw Jesus out of our town. But I wonder if we're not missing the point if we've jumped to that conclusion. See, the error of these Nazarenes is that they have tried to box God into something predictable, something that they can control, like our little demonstration with the water. They're used to God's blessings coming straight through this cup, filling up their cup, and then the other people can get their share. But Jesus' actions in the synagogue, the words that he speaks, they are pushing against those boundaries. They are breaking the walls down of their little box. Jesus speaks of their God, but as a God for the other, as a God who cares most for the outcast and the foreigner. Jesus speaks of how the words of the prophet Isaiah have now come true, but it's not necessarily for them. I don't think their indignation is too far from our hearts most days. Sometimes when we hear people say something along the lines of, well, we should serve the refugees in our communities, that voice in the back of our head says, yes, but don't we have our own homeless who we need to deal with? Sometimes we hear the words, Black Lives Matter, and we want to interject, well, really all lives matter. And they do, but that's not the point. When we see people protesting on the street and think, there are people just trying to get to their jobs, or just trying to get to work, why are they out there doing this? And it is to these sort of things, these sort of thoughts that fill our brain, that Jesus responds and says, there were all kinds of widows in Israel, but Elijah wasn't sent to them, but instead to a foreigner in Zarephath. Israel had plenty of lepers, but only Naaman the Syrian was healed by Elisha, the Syrian, an enemy of the Jewish people. Jesus is here reminding us that whenever we try to place our own tribe, our own box in the forefront of God's favor, we place ourselves in the way of what God is doing in the world. Because this is the truly remarkable thing about the good news that we carry into the world. It's either good news for all of us, or it's not good enough. It's either truly gospel for all of the world, or it's not really gospel for any of us. It's either we tell the whole truth of God's unstoppable grace, or it's just us patting ourselves on the back. And Jesus desperately needs these people in Nazareth, needs us to understand the difference between the two. So we have to ask ourselves the question, are these words of grace still graceful even if they aren't necessarily meant for us? Those in the synagogue of Nazareth hear the words that begin by giving them joy, but only if it fits their plans, if it fits within their box and their desires. They are stuck seeing their relationship with God as a world where God showers blessings directly onto them and theirs, a personal God that is for them first and for others second. The idea that God's Messiah might shower blessings in a way that they don't agree with leads them to anger, even so far as to incite them into a literal, murderous rage. And this is what happens when we think our way is the only way. It's kind of like Patriots fans. They are okay as long as their team is in the Super Bowl, but root for someone else. Come on now. Just forget about it. But the thing for us to remember is that this is never how Jesus operates. This is the good news that we still need to hear. It's a reminder that we follow after a Christ who is headed into the margins of our world. He was then and he is now. A Savior who gives life to the outsider, reminding us that God's heart is so much more open than we give God credit for. But the same question that was asked then is set before us today. Do we follow after this Jesus, or do we fight back in anger? Do we want God's blessings all for ourselves, or are we willing to see the greater thing that God has planned? Who is it that are the people of Capernaum in our day? Who is the Naaman from Syria? Who is the widow of Zarephath? Who are these who stand outside of what we would normally consider our gospel? This week I was reminded of how powerful love can be when it's done for the sake of the other. As I mentioned, I was back in Illinois, and well, I missed the brutalest part of the cold by escaping down to St. Louis in the nick of time. Those who were around Chicago felt temperatures that dropped to negative 55 with the wind chill. And in the midst of the most brutal cold to hit the Midwest in my lifetime, I heard a story of one woman who saw the plight of some of those who were outside of this box, those who were homeless in Chicago, specifically those who lived in one tent city on the south side. Looking for something tangible she could do for those in need, she initially took her own credit card. She didn't have enough money in the bank, so she took her credit card and purchased 20 rooms for one night. Others hearing about this need stepped in, and they ended up booking 40 more rooms and booking all of them through to the end of the week. She went out and found people who were stuck on the streets and brought them to a warm place where they could survive. These were people who were illegally squatting. In fact, one group of them were operating propane tanks illegally in order to keep warm. One of them actually had a malfunction, and so the police had to come in and confiscate these devices. And when that happened, Candace Payne had a choice. She could leave them to their own devices, the consequences of their actions, or step in with an offer of grace that many thought was too good to be true. See, this is a story of the gospel in our times, of something that goes beyond the borders that we consider, of grace and hope that splashes over and breaks through our ideas of who it is that deserves it. And I pray for each of us here that it is a reminder of the immense power of this story of love we have in the gospel. A story that we are called to follow, a story that 1 Corinthians tells us we are equipped to do. but it begins in our love. I think it's fitting that this gospel text ends with Jesus almost mysteriously, magically disappearing from their midst. They had Jesus right where they wanted him, but it wasn't the right place. They had Jesus, they had him surrounded, but to harm instead of help, to throw him off a cliff instead of to follow. And this is the miraculous thing for us, is if we let ourselves listen, if we let ourselves follow, we can walk right along with this Jesus as he goes off to the places that need to hear his words and need to experience his blessings. And so I pray that this story of love, this gospel of hope, would fill you today and every day more. Amen.